The first thing people noticed about the Caldwell plantation was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over fields at dusk, but a silence that felt held in place, as though the land itself had been told to keep its mouth shut. Even the cicadas seemed to hesitate before singing. Those who passed the wrought iron gates spoke later of an unease they could not name, a pressure behind the eyes, a sense that something vast and watching lay just beyond the tree line. Mr. Caldwell ruled that land with a rigid certainty, a man who believed order could be enforced into anything: soil, flesh, bloodline. His daughter, Eleanor, had become the one flaw in that belief. She moved through the house like a burden the walls had learned to accommodate, her presence bending corridors and conversations alike. He never spoke her name aloud in public. Inside the house, servants learned to step aside without looking up, as if her very visibility was an offense that might be punished. When she was taken from the main house, there was no announcement, no carriage in daylight, only a lantern-lit path leading toward the far quarters, where the trees grew close and the air smelled of damp earth and iron. The man chosen to receive her was known for his silence. He worked without complaint, without curiosity, without the small rebellions others clung to for survival. Some said he had forgotten how to speak. Others said he was listening to something no one else could hear. Weeks passed, then months. The plantation continued its rhythms, but they felt rehearsed, hollow. At night, lights burned where they never had before. Shapes moved behind drawn curtains. Once, a scream rose from the fields, not sharp, but long and low, like breath being forced through something too narrow to allow it. When Eleanor finally returned, even her father struggled to recognize what stood before him. She occupied space differently now, as if the air had learned to move around her instead of resisting. Her eyes held no plea, no accusation, only a quiet certainty that made grown men avert their gaze. The silence that followed her into the house was complete, and in that silence, the plantation began to understand what it had truly given away. The bargain was never written, because writing would have made it real in ways even Mr. Caldwell feared. It began instead as a thought he refused to finish, a solution that formed in the spaces between prayers and ledgers, between what the world saw and what the walls of his house knew too well. His plantation thrived on appearances as straight rows, clean accounts, a name spoken with respect in neighboring counties. Yet inside the house, there was a presence that disrupted this careful order, a reminder that blood did not always obey intention. Each time he passed his daughter in the corridor, he felt the weight of failure pressing against his ribs. Not because of her body alone, but because she existed outside the narrow shape he believed legacy should take. He told himself he was being merciful. That was how the thought learned to breathe. Mercy, discipline, correction. Words he could hold without trembling. The man he chose to leave from the quarters was known for his stillness, for the way his eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond the fields. Caldwell had watched him for years, noting how others unconsciously stepped aside, how even overseers spoke to him with unease. There were rumors, of course. There were always rumors. Caldwell dismissed them publicly, while privately allowing them to settle into his decision like stones at the bottom of a river. The meeting took place at night, away from witnesses who might later remember details incorrectly. The offer was framed as duty, cloaked in the language of order and necessity. Caldwell spoke of responsibility, of a task that would protect the household and ensure silence. He never used his daughter's name. To name her would have made the act too human, too vulnerable. Instead, he referred to her as a problem that required containment, as something that must be reshaped for the good of all involved. The man listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing. But when Caldwell finished speaking, there was a pause long enough to feel like judgment. In that pause, Caldwell sensed something shift, as if the land itself had leaned closer. When the man finally nodded, it was not obedience that Caldwell felt, but recognition, as though the words spoken had unlocked a door that had always been waiting. From that night on, the house changed. Servants avoided certain hallways. Candles burned lower faster. Caldwell slept poorly, haunted by the feeling that the agreement had not been as one-sided as he'd believed, that in attempting to erase a flaw from his lineage, he had invited something ancient and patient into the very structure of his home. Something that did not forget, did not forgive, and did not belong to him at all. They told the household Eleanor was being sent away for her own good, that the air near the river would strengthen her lungs and the distance would quiet the gossip that clung to her like humidity. The explanation was offered only once, in Mr. Caldwell's measured voice, and never repeated. On the morning she was moved, the sun had not yet cleared the trees, and the fog lay so thick across the yard that the buildings appeared detached from the ground, floating structures waiting to drift apart. Eleanor walked without protest, her steps slow but deliberate, as if she understood that resistance would only make the journey longer. No trunk followed her, no keepsakes, nothing to suggest she would return unchanged. The path led away from the main house and toward a cluster of structures rarely mentioned except in passing. The smell there was different. Damp wood, old smoke, something mineral and sharp beneath it all. The man waited where the fog thinned, standing with his hands folded, his posture neither submissive nor defiant. He did not look at Eleanor until she stopped in front of him, and when he did, his gaze held no curiosity. It was as though he were measuring time rather than flesh, counting something invisible that had already begun. The first days passed without incident, at least none that could be named. Food was delivered and taken away untouched, then later consumed with careful precision. The sounds that drifted back toward the house were ordinary at first: footsteps, the creak of boards, water being drawn. But servants began to notice the absences. Eleanor no longer crossed the yard at dusk. The man no longer appeared in the fields at dawn. Their removal from the daily rhythm created a hollow space, an interruption that made everyone acutely aware of what had once been constant. At night, light blood from cracks in the walls where no lamps had burned before. Sometimes it flickered, sometimes it remained steady for hours, casting strange shadows that stretched and twisted across the ground. A cook swore she heard chanting once, though she could not recall the words afterward, only the sensation of pressure behind her ears, as if the air had thickened around her head. Another servant claimed to hear Eleanor's voice, low and strained, not calling for help but repeating something over and over, as though learning it by heart. Mr. Caldwell refused to acknowledge these reports. He became stricter, quicker to anger, his temper snapping like dry wood. He insisted the process required time, that change was never comfortable, that those who complained lacked the discipline to understand necessary measures. Yet even he could not ignore the way the house responded. Doors stuck where they never had, mirrors clouded without cause. The long hallway outside Eleanor's former room developed a coldness that no fire could dispel, and passing through it felt like walking through a held breath. As weeks turned into months, rumors escaped the plantation boundaries. Travelers spoke of strange figures moving near the tree line at night, of sounds like heavy breathing carried on the wind. A neighboring farmer claimed his livestock refused to graze near the fence closest to Caldwell's land, huddling instead at the far end of the field, as if pressed there by an unseen force. The plantation's name, once spoken with admiration, began to draw uneasy pauses, sentences left unfinished. Within the quarters, the man's role grew increasingly ambiguous. He was seen less often, but when he did appear, his movements had changed. There was a deliberateness to them, a care that suggested he was following instructions not given aloud. Those who watched him felt an urge to look away, unsettled by the sense that they were witnessing something meant to remain unseen. When asked where he had been, he offered no answer, only a look that implied the question itself was misplaced. Eleanor's transformation announced itself gradually, not through spectacle but through absence. The sound of her breathing, once labored and constant, faded from the night. The space she occupied seemed to contract, as if the walls were learning to contain her more efficiently. Once, a servant caught a glimpse of her through an open doorway and later struggled to describe what she had seen, insisting only that Eleanor's posture was different, that she held herself as though the weight she carried had shifted inward, rearranged rather than removed. Fear settled over the plantation like a second fog. People spoke in whispers, avoided certain paths, crossed themselves before sleeping even if they had never been religious. Mr. Caldwell walked the grounds at night, lantern in hand, as if patrolling against an enemy he could not name. Each step reinforced the truth he refused to voice. Whatever was happening beyond the walls was no longer under his control. The pretense of care had curdled into something ritualistic, repetitive, driven by rules that revealed themselves only through obedience. By the time the household realized Eleanor was no longer being sent away but remade, it was too late to interrupt the process. The bargain had settled into place, tightening with each passing day, and the plantation adjusted around it, learning new silences, new shadows, new ways to pretend that what was being done served a purpose that could still be justified, even as the land itself seemed to recoil, holding its breath, waiting for what would emerge. When the door finally opened, the man's days in the fields ended without announcement, as though the land itself had released him from its expectations. At first, overseers assumed illness or punishment accounted for his absence, but no orders had been given and no explanation offered. He simply stopped appearing where he was meant to be, and no one felt confident enough to demand his return. When he did emerge from the trees near the quarters, it was at irregular hours, his clothing cleaner than labor required, his hands bearing none of the damage that honest work inflicted. He moved with a composure that unsettled those who noticed it, a steadiness that suggested purpose rather than survival. What he did within the secluded structure was never witnessed directly, yet signs accumulated like fingerprints no one dared acknowledge. Water was carried in greater quantities than before, then returned half-used, clouded with sediment that did not match the soil nearby. Ash appeared in small, deliberate piles behind the building, not scattered as refuse, but arranged as though counted. Tools went missing from sheds and reappeared days later in unfamiliar places, wiped clean, their edges dulled in ways that implied use against something neither wood nor stone. Those closest to the quarters began to sense a rhythm, an order unfolding beyond spoken command. Certain nights demanded silence, others tolerated movement. Sometimes the man would stand outside just before dawn, eyes closed, breathing slow and controlled, as if listening for permission. At other times he worked through the night, the faint sound of motion carrying through the trees, neither frantic nor hesitant, but methodical. It became clear to those who watched from a distance that he was not improvising. Whatever actions he performed followed a structure that predated the plantation's fences, a logic indifferent to ownership or hierarchy. Mr. Caldwell attempted once to assert authority, approaching the quarters with his lantern raised. His voice sharpened by fear disguised as anger. He did not cross the threshold. Something in the air shifted as he drew close, a pressure that forced breath from his lungs and left his thoughts scrambling for shape. The man stepped into view then, blocking the doorway without touching it, his presence firm but not confrontational. He said nothing. He did not need to. Caldwell understood, with sudden clarity, that commands held no currency here. That whatever governed the work unfolding inside answered to older terms. From that point forward, Caldwell watched instead. He stationed himself at windows, lingered at the edges of clearings, tracked time through shadows rather than clocks. What he saw disturbed him more than defiance ever could. The man exhibited a precision that bordered on reverence, adjusting details with care, repeating actions until they met an internal standard no one else could measure. There was no cruelty in his movements, no visible pleasure, only a focused attention that treated Eleanor's presence as a condition to be addressed rather than a person to be managed. The change in Eleanor became undeniable during this period, though few could articulate exactly how. Her silhouette shifted behind curtains, her movements growing smaller, more contained, as if she were learning new boundaries from within. The sounds she made no longer resembled distress. They were purposeful, timed, sometimes ceasing altogether for long stretches. When her voice did surface, it carried a different quality, lower, steadier, stripped of the softness that once marked it as familiar. The man's role, once defined entirely by subjugation, began to invert in subtle ways. Others deferred to him without realizing they were doing so, stepping aside when he passed, lowering their voices in his presence. Even those who despised him felt compelled to obey unspoken rules that followed him like a wake. He did not enforce this authority. It arose naturally, shaped by the certainty with which he moved through the world, by the sense that he was acting in accordance with something inevitable. At times, it seemed as though he was less a participant than a conduit. Objects left near the quarters shifted position overnight. Marks appeared on the ground that no foot could have made alone. The air itself felt arranged, charged with intent. The man responded to these changes with calm acceptance, adjusting his actions as though receiving instructions that arrived without language. Those who observed him felt the unsettling impression that he was being guided, not by a master, but by a process that required completion. What terrified Caldwell most was not the loss of control, but the realization that the man had never truly lacked it. His silence had not been emptiness, but restraint. His obedience had been selective, strategic, a means of surviving until the conditions were right. Now, within the boundaries Caldwell himself had authorized, the man exercised a form of authorship that could not be revoked. He shaped outcomes rather than merely enduring them, and he did so without malice, without haste, with the patience of something that understood time differently. As the work continued, the plantation itself seemed to respond, settling into a new equilibrium that acknowledged the shift in power. The land grew quieter, the nights heavier. Caldwell's authority shrank to the confines of his own thoughts, where doubt festered unchecked. He began to understand that whatever was being done to Eleanor was only part of a larger transformation, one that implicated every order he had enforced, every assumption he had relied upon. The man was no longer simply carrying out a task. He was revealing, through action alone, the fragile illusion upon which the plantation had been built, an illusion that unraveled with each careful, deliberate movement until nothing remained but the undeniable truth that the story was no longer being written by those who believed they owned it. Eleanor returned without ceremony, stepping back into the main house as though she had never left it, though everything about her suggested otherwise. There was no announcement, no gathering of servants to witness her arrival, only the soft sound of the front door closing behind her, and the subtle shift that followed, as if the house had adjusted its posture to accommodate a different presence. She stood in the entryway for a long moment, breathing evenly, her gaze lifting to the ceiling as though taking inventory of the space. When she moved, it was with a control that had never belonged to her before, each step placed with intention rather than effort. Those who saw her struggled to reconcile memory with observation. Her body bore the marks of change, but not in the way they had expected. The excess that once defined her had not vanished so much as reorganized, redistributed into a form that felt deliberate, almost architectural. She carried herself upright, her shoulders squared, her movements economical, as if she had learned how to inhabit her own weight instead of being burdened by it. The effect was unsettling, not because she appeared diminished, but because she appeared resolved. Her eyes unsettled them most. They no longer searched the room for approval or braced themselves for judgment. They met gazes directly, without challenge or submission, holding them just long enough to make people uncomfortable, before moving on. It was the look of someone who understood the rules of a place and no longer felt bound by them. Conversations faltered in her presence. Tasks were forgotten. Even Mr. Caldwell found himself hesitating before addressing her, his authority faltering under the quiet certainty she projected. The house responded to her as well. Doors opened more easily when she approached. The cold that had lingered in the hall outside her former room dissipated, replaced by a neutral stillness that felt deliberate rather than empty. At night, footsteps echoed differently, as though the floors themselves were learning a new rhythm. Servants whispered that the house recognized her now, that whatever had been done beyond its walls had aligned her with the structure in ways blood alone never had. The man did not accompany her inside. He remained at the edge of the grounds, watching as she crossed the threshold, his role complete in a way no one else could comprehend. When Eleanor turned back to look at him, there was no gratitude in her expression, no resentment, only acknowledgement. Whatever had passed between them required no further exchange. She carried the result within herself, contained and irreversible. Mr. Caldwell attempted to reclaim his position through formality, inviting Eleanor to dine, addressing her with the measured politeness he reserved for guests rather than family. The effort exposed the fracture he could no longer hide. Eleanor listened without interruption, then responded in a voice that was calm, steady, and unfamiliar. She spoke of the land, of the way it held memory, of how certain structures endured not because they were strong, but because they adapted. Her words were not confrontational, yet they stripped his assumptions bare, leaving him uncertain how to reply. The plantation adjusted around her presence in subtle, unavoidable ways. Laborers altered their routes to pass near her without knowing why. Arguments quieted when she entered a space. Even animals seemed attuned to her, lifting their heads as she passed, their agitation easing. It was as though she emitted a gravity that drew order toward her, not the brittle order enforced by punishment, but a cohesion born of understanding. Rumors spread quickly beyond the plantation. Some claimed Eleanor had been cured, others that she had been replaced. Visitors remarked on the strangeness of her composure, the way her gaze lingered on people, as if assessing their intentions. A preacher refused to sit at her table, muttering about transformations that did not come from God. Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied these stories. She allowed them to circulate, understanding their utility, recognizing that fear often enforced boundaries more effectively than force. What disturbed Mr. Caldwell most was the realization that Eleanor no longer required his protection or his permission. She navigated the social spaces of the plantation with ease, anticipating reactions, redirecting conversations, exerting influence without raising her voice. The shame he had once sought to erase had been transmuted into something formidable, something that reflected his own cruelty back at him with quiet precision. In attempting to correct what he saw as a flaw, he had facilitated a transformation that exposed the fragility of his authority. At night, Eleanor walked the grounds alone, tracing the boundaries of the land with measured steps. She paused often, listening, attuned to sounds no one else seemed to notice. Those who watched from windows felt an inexplicable sense of calm mixed with dread, as if witnessing the settling of a balance that had long been overdue. The plantation no longer revolved around Mr. Caldwell's will. It oriented itself toward Eleanor's presence, toward the certainty she embodied, toward the truth that whatever had been taken apart beyond. The trees had been reassembled with purpose, leaving behind a figure who could not be reduced to the roles imposed upon her, and who carried within her the quiet knowledge that the final reckoning had only just begun. The collapse did not announce itself through fire or revolt, but through a gradual failure of things that had once seemed permanent. The first sign was the land. Crops grew unevenly, not dying outright but refusing uniformity, rows bending away from straight lines, as if following a different geometry. Tools broke in the hands of men who had used them for decades. Wood splitting along unfamiliar faults, metal snapping without strain. The plantation systems continued to operate, but only in fragments, like a machine that remembered its purpose but no longer recognized its operator. Mr. Caldwell felt the erosion most acutely in moments that should have reinforced his authority. Orders were heard but not absorbed, acknowledged without urgency, carried out according to interpretations he had not given. People no longer looked to him for confirmation. They acted as though a decision had already been made elsewhere, and they were merely aligning themselves with it. He accused them of insolence, of laziness, but the words failed to land. His voice carried no weight. It dissipated into the air, absorbed by walls that no longer echoed it back. Eleanor did not challenge him directly. That was what unsettled him most. She moved through the plantation as a fixed point around which everything else adjusted. When disputes arose, they resolved themselves before reaching her, as though participants sensed her awareness even in absence. She did not punish or reward. She observed, and the observation itself altered behavior. Caldwell began to understand that power did not always announce itself through command. Sometimes it arrived quietly, taking up space until resistance became impractical. The man vanished without explanation. One morning, he simply did not appear where he had been seen the night before, standing at the edge of the grounds, watching the house with a stillness that suggested farewell. No search was organized. No questions were asked aloud. It was understood, in a way no one could articulate, that his departure was not an escape but a conclusion. Whatever role he had fulfilled had reached its natural end, and the land did not require him to linger. With his absence came a shift in atmosphere that felt like a release and a tightening at once. The nights grew quieter, but heavier. The air pressed down on the plantation, carrying a sense of finality that unsettled even those who could not name its source. Caldwell began to experience the house as a hostile environment, its corridors narrowing, its ceilings lowering, its rooms rearranging themselves in his perception. He slept poorly, waking with the certainty that something had been decided without him. Eleanor's relationship to the house was markedly different. She moved through it with ease, opening windows Caldwell had sealed, repurposing rooms that had gone unused for years. She did not erase the past, but she did not preserve it either. Objects tied to old rituals of control were relocated, stripped of their symbolic positions. Portraits were taken down and leaned against walls, their gazes rendered powerless by the change in orientation. The house did not resist her, it accommodated. The plantation's reputation collapsed next. Visitors stopped arriving. Credit dried up. Neighbors who once sought Caldwell's counsel avoided his letters, returned them unopened. The social structures that had reinforced his authority withdrew their recognition, leaving him isolated within a title that no longer functioned. He attempted to invoke tradition, to remind others of obligations owed to him by history. But history had begun to rearrange itself, shading his version in favor of something more honest, more unstable. Caldwell confronted Eleanor one evening in the parlor, his anger sharpened by desperation. He accused her of orchestrating his downfall, of undermining him through manipulation and spectacle. She listened, hands folded, expression unreadable. When he finished, breathless and trembling, she spoke quietly, pointing out that she had done nothing he had not already set in motion. The systems collapsing around him, she explained, had been brittle long before her return. They had only required pressure in the right places to reveal their weakness. That night, Caldwell walked the grounds until dawn, his lantern swinging wildly, casting distorted shadows across the fields. He saw evidence of his failure everywhere, not as punishment but as consequence. The plantation had not turned against him. It had simply stopped pretending that his authority was natural or necessary. The realization hollowed him out, leaving behind a man sustained only by memory, clinging to a version of himself the world no longer recognized. By morning, the house felt different again. Lighter, though no windows had been opened. Eleanor stood at the front steps, watching the land with a measured calm. Workers moved with quiet efficiency, responding to her presence without instruction. The plantation continued to function, but its purpose had shifted. It no longer existed to reinforce a single man's control. It operated as an organism adjusting to new conditions, shading what it could no longer sustain. Caldwell retreated inward, confining himself to a shrinking territory within the house, his world narrowing to a few rooms heavy with the residue of his former power. He became a figure of habit rather than authority, tolerated rather than obeyed. The land outside no longer acknowledged him. The house remembered him only as an echo. Eleanor remained. She did not claim ownership in words, did not announce a new order, but her presence redefined everything it touched. The transformation she embodied extended outward, implicating structures, relationships, histories. What had been done could not be undone, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. The plantation settled into this truth, with the inevitability of something long overdue, leaving behind the wreckage of a system that had mistaken domination for permanence, and had finally been forced to confront the cost of its own design.